thank you. And thank you all for coming out. It's a little bit close to Christmas. Santa Claus might come wandering through here at any minute. Anyway, I have been at South Alabama. I was fortunate enough to work at South Alabama for till 2013. And in 1997, Greg and I made a trip to visit Old St. Stephen's and met with the current director at that time. And ever since that first visit in 1997, I've been captivated by St. Stephen's. It's an unbelievable site. It's a very important site historically and archaeologically. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I hope some of you, when you see the quiz up here that asks you what the first state capital it was, you can get it because it was St. Stephen's. The interesting thing about St. Stephen's is most people, or a lot of people, shall I say, do not really know where it is. And if you look on this map and you see up toward the top here, there's St. Stephen's along the Tombigbee River. Here's Mobile down here, and here's Mount Vernon right there. The causeway that you now know comes across right in here. Well, there's a very important point to make when you look at this map, and that is this line right here. That is the top of the line over the north side of Spanish West Florida. At the 31st parallel, it's the line that goes all the way across. And please note that St. Stephen's is considerably north of it, because that's going to come up in our discussion. The first governor to really have any particular interest in St. Stephen's was Esteban Mero. But before that, woodland people and Native Americans had lived on this in this area for several thousand years at least. So they're the first occupant of the site. And then we have the historic Choctaw, that this was their territory. Across the other side of the Tombigbee was more of the land that was ruled by the Creeks. And we know how that turned out. But Esteban, about the first fort, he put the first fort up there about 1788, 89. And the reason he said he put it up there is because so many people were beginning to settle in the area, he felt they needed some support. So he built the first fort up there, and then he rebuilt it in 1795. So evidently there were a fair number of people living there that early. And if you, in 1795, there was a treaty passed, signed, called the Treaty of San Lorenzo, and it ceded all lands of the Spanish north of that 31st parallel that we were looking at to the Americans. The problem is we didn't know where that 31st parallel was. The Spain and the Spanish government in Mobile claimed that St. Stephen's was south of it. Well, we weren't at war with Spain. We were actually quite friendly with them at that time. So it's like we couldn't go to war to get St. Stephen's. So Andrew Ellicott was hired, and with the help of another associate from the Spanish government, they surveyed the line and indeed found that St. Stephen's was north of it, as well as Mount Vernon and quite a bit of other territory. Well, in May of 1799, the Spanish notified the Americans they were evacuating. They did, and the first American flag was raised over the fort. It is the first American flag to ever be raised over the territory that would become Alabama. This is a map from about 1802, excuse me. And if you notice the Tombigbee River, which is this area going up through here, you see these little dots along there, and that legend over here. These are families that have settled along the river, and you see that they're about every half mile along the river and along every big tributary that leads into it. That's a lot of people for that early period of time. And this is St. Stephen's. You see this little blow up of it, which is up here. A few houses sent around the old fort, but there's not there's still a lot of people living up there. The interesting thing is that most of these names on this list do not appear in later records. So why is that? Well, we'll talk about that in a bit. This was the first time the Americans finally put some feet on the ground in St. Stephen's was about 1803. So they went 3 or 4 years, little happened, even though the fort had been ceded over to the Americans. But then they put the Choctaw Trading House there. This was an idea, which I'm sure you're all trading post and trading house. It was to establish commerce with the local natives and to try to sort of Americanize them, away from their ways in order to make friends. And, I don't know what there were quite a few other things that didn't quite work out, but that was what the plan was. So that was one of the most important things. And then the second most important thing, and it was probably had more effect, was the land office was located there in 1804. The land office was charged with adjudicating claims over the whole region. And you can imagine a government, a land office that had 3 colonial governments over a period of the previous 100 years, had a lot of different people claiming pieces of land, and the 3 commissioners that were in charge of that had to look at each claim and decide whether it should be honored or not, and make a recommendation which could or could not or might not be accepted by the U.S. Congress. But generally they were accepted. But they worked very hard with that, and Ephraim Kirby was one of the first commissioners. He subsequently was appointed a Superior Court judge, but he never held court, and he died within a year or so after this of what was called bilious fever, which is really probably the yellow fever. They did have a post office by 1805. But the population of St. Stephen's was still quite slim. This is the original indenture for the town, which is dated 1811. However, we know by 1807, because of land deeds, that they were selling lots in the town. This is actually the layout of the town. And if you notice, there are 2 other towns that are very closely associated. You have Rodney here and Franklin over here. Rodney was fairly well developed. Franklin, not so much. It was probably more than 20 or 30% of the lots were ever sold. This is the landing down here. So everybody that came into St. Stephen's had to come from there. This was a huge bluff out here of limestone. So that's a very important point. And the further you got away from that, the less desirable the lots were. This is a map that was drawn in 1899 by Mary Welch. She was born in St. Stephen's in 1823, and she lived there until for about the first 10 or 12 years of her life, went to school there, and they got her back in 1899 at the centennial celebration and one of the things she did is she wrote down her Reminiscences. If you've never read that, you should read it. It's a fabulous document. You can get it online here from archives. It's called The Reminiscences of Mary Welch, and it tells about her life there as a child, and it's a great document. She's a beautiful writer. She was a school teacher all her life and very accomplished. But this map is not geographically correct in its alignment, but she has a legend that goes with this, and it's pretty accurate in terms of where the people actually lived. So it's a great map. In 1814, one of the most important things to affect this region, which was known as the Tombigbee Region at the time, it was on the southwestern frontier of the new country. And people in the east and along the southern Atlantic coast were very fascinated by St. Stephen's and the whole region, because that was like unknown territory. It was a place of opportunity. It was a place where you might go out there and become rich. So they were very interested. The Creek War, which I'm sure most of you are fairly familiar with, is sort of an outcrop of the War of 1812, but it started with, let's say, Fort Mims, and it ended with the Indian removal after Horseshoe Bend, so it didn't work out so well for Native Americans. But what it did is it made the territory safe. So in 1815 to 16, after the Creek War, the federal road that came from Milledgeville, Georgia, down to around St. Stephen's became safe. You could go down it without thinking you might get scalped around the next corner or shot by a robber or whatever. It became relatively safe, although it was considered a very difficult road. to come down. Alabama Territory became chartered created by the Congress in 1817 when Mississippi became a state, and the St. Stephen's folks were very involved in all that decision about where the line would be. At first they didn't want it, but at first the idea was to put it on the river, but the people from St. Stephen's didn't favor that at all because they said the Natchez area where the government was located had never been interested at all in St. Stephen's or the Tombigbee, so they wanted the whole thing, and they eventually got that. So in 1817, you have the Alabama Territory created, but St. Stephen's was the only town of really any size in the territory, so it became the first capital of the state of Alabama and the territorial capital. And it was where the legislature first met in 1818, and they met the second time in the last part of 1818. The population of St. Stephen's had been very small up until after the Creek War, but by 1816 or 17, the population had grown to the point where there was about 40 buildings in the town. But by the end of 1817 and 1818, there were 450 buildings in the town, and the population had grown to probably 2,000 or 3,000. That doesn't sound like a very big town, but Mobile was about 1,200 at the time. So it was a big town. But it reached its peak about 1820, and then it started to decline. This happened to many towns on the river. The real sense was it didn't have any real way to support itself. It had supported itself primarily by people coming there and being able to purchase land that had been ceded to the U.S. after the Creek War. But then they began to get these rumors. It's like, let's go west. And Texas became the place. Let's go to Texas. We can get rich in Texas. Well, we know what Texas looks like. Alabama looks a lot better than Texas in some ways. So, but this was the first great migration of people from the east to the west. And so it was a very important movement in this country, but it was the very first one. By the 1820s, the town was in decline. And it dwindled to about 350 people by 1822, but it lasted as a very small community until the Civil War. This is Governor Bibb, who was very much involved in the first, he was appointed governor, and he actually, the first legislature chartered a group of legislators to come up with a recommendation where the capital would be. Well, they came back at the second meeting and wanted to make it in Tuscaloosa, but he wanted it in Cahaba. And he had actually gained free land from his buddies up in the federal government, and that's how he kind of sold it. He failed, unfortunately, to tell anybody that he had, in the interim between the first meeting in January and the next meeting in November, purchased a lot of land in Cahaba. So when I read that, I thought, how crazy, Alabama's first governor does such a thing. And nobody really thought that much about it when it never came to light until after he died on a horseback ride before 1820. Well, it wouldn't be a story about St. Stephen's if I didn't tell you the legend, the curse of St. Stephen's, which is that bats and owls will inhabit the city and make it their home, and pestilence will soon drive the inhabitants from the city. Mary Welch first tells this story as being a traveling minister, was in town. There weren't churches at the time. The church movement in Alabama doesn't really get going at all until the 1820s and by 1830s. So there was no church in St. Stephen's. They met in places, homes, and they met in the theater, which was considered by many as an abomination. But there was no church. So this itinerant preacher was out preaching one day, and some young men heard him and came over there and started listening, and they took exception to what he was saying, and they put him on a log and pushed him out into the Tombigbee River. And that's when he uttered the curse. That story makes kind of sense to me. I mean, how would you like to be pushed out in the river on a log? But the story has completely been embellished to include Lorenzo Dow, who was the most famous traveling preacher of the period, and it probably was not Lorenzo Dow. And in fact, they supposedly tarred and feathered him, which they certainly did not do. So it's just interesting how legends start and grow. The St. Stephen's Historical Commission was founded in 1988 by local citizens who were interested in trying to preserve the site. It was founded. It was chartered by the state of Alabama. Unfortunately, it is technically a state park, but unfortunately, it gets no funding. So it is not part of the state park system, just like Blakely and several other Blanton Springs and other sites in the state. And we don't show up on the state park webpage either. So that's just been a constant problem. We have received some funding over the years, but in the last 6 or 8 years, almost nothing. Well, St. Stephen's Park, though, from an archaeological standpoint, when I first made that visit to it in 1997, the thing that intrigued me was the fact that there were cellar pits, remnants of walls, all sorts of things that I could see on the ground. So when St. Stephen's was abandoned prior to the Civil War, it lay there just completely untouched. So if people came over the period of time to collect things, if they were building a house, they might come get rocks for a chimney or bricks or whatever. So things off the top of the ground kind of disappeared, but under the ground, no, they weren't going to dig to get bricks. So that it gradually just kind of went down to the ground. But it was untouched in that period, and that's not true of most archaeological sites. Usually somebody else comes along and builds a town or something else on that site. So let's talk a little about archaeology. St. Stephen's Archaeology. Okay, I forgot these are... I love these posters. It was a fabulous movie, but it was just a movie. And he is, in today's understanding of Indiana Jones, he would be considered a looter. I hate to tell you that, but anyway, it did put archaeology kind of on the map for a while, so we appreciate that. In 1997, we received a grant from the Alabama Historical Commission through the trust fund that was created there, and we mapped the whole site. We located about 55 structures that were definitely identified by visible walls, which there were very few, or cellar pits, or wells, or things that we could actually know that's a house, that's a building of some kind. So 55, they said there were 450. There probably were. We just didn't identify anything that was questionable. This is a drawing on the left that we made of this structure, which ended up with the number 13. You see the wall across the front there, that right there, and that's this wall in that picture there. We cleaned off the site, drew all the stuff on the surface, and that was about it. We since found out that it was on this lot right here, 137. It's that building right there. And in 1999, with 2 volunteers, I started an excavation on the front of that wall, and the first thing that we came down on was melted glass, drips of glass. And we had been, the rumors were in some of the documents that the building had been burned. Mary Welch talks about young guys with their cups going from house to house and burning old buildings with their cups. I think she means whiskey cups. And so this house was actually burned because we found the drips of the window glass, and we knew that it had been burned. The other thing we found that there's a brick pattern here, which is not too visible. It's a herringbone pattern. If you know what a herringbone pattern is like, it's an interweaving kind of pattern, very difficult to lay, the most expensive that you could have. So the people, when they built this building, they spent money on it. This was not something that they thought would be just here for a while. So in '99, we started excavating on this project. We found out also that it had been occupied as the Globe Hotel. The Globe Hotel, unfortunately, probably got finished just about the time the town reached its peak, and as the town declined, there just wasn't enough business to keep it going. By 1822, it was closed, and by 1826, it was sold to Reuben Chamberlain and Hannah Chamberlain, where they lived and raised their children and ran a dry goods store until 1848. But this is about 2003 in the excavation, and you see what we find. None of this, no rocks that you see here, no walls, nothing was visible above the ground. But we tested around and we actually found spots and began digging. This is about 2003 right here. So is this. We're fortunate enough to have 3 expeditions of the Alabama Museum of Natural History in Tuscaloosa. And they bring young folks to the site for 3 or 4 weeks during the summer. And those folks actually learn about science. And it was started by Dr. John Hall almost 40 years ago. So in 2018, we have got the honor of having the next expedition, number 40, which is a big thing for them. It's kind of a milestone. And they will be at St. Stephen's working on the Douglas Hotel. The Douglas Hotel, which I'll show you later, is actually the site where the first legislature met. So it is St. Stephen's is where Alabama began, and the Douglas Hotel is exactly where the legislature met. This is the other thing that we've done. We don't have any money, so we've never been able to afford to hire crews and things, other than the first 2 grants that we did receive. And so now we use volunteers. So this has been a big public outreach program. I cannot tell you, I have the records, but I've never had the time to count them. We have definitely had thousands of people participate in this program, including the expedition and field schools. But we have also had Saturday digs, at least 4 or 5 in the spring and 4 or 5 in the fall. And this is sort of a typical group of folks that have shown up to dig. We've required no age limits, and no experience is required. But you do real archaeology. This is not sandbox stuff. We also have a lab there at the site, which was built by the director and the park, and we do a lot of processing there initially, and then once it's finally processed, it goes back to South Alabama, where I have volunteers there that work on it. And you can see right here, we're working on analysis of glass vessels, and here we're probably washing ceramics, but without volunteers, we would go nowhere. We have every Tuesday we have volunteers there, and then I spend a lot more time than that. This is in 2003. That's the slave quarters, and there's 3 different rooms to that. And it was actually built in 2 different episodes. This building was first. It had a nice big hearth in it and a kitchen. And these are 2 additional rooms that were added probably during the hotel period, which starts about, it goes up to about 1822. This is the cellar of the building, which we were still excavating well into the 2008, 7, 8, 9. One of the problems is that this cellar right here, you see, is just absolutely full of dirt. And to systematically excavate that took a long time. This is what it looked like when it was finished. And as you notice, the ash on the floor here, we saved that last 6 or 8 inches to the end because that was what happened when the building burned. Everything fell into the cellar, including 3 brick chimneys, which had to be reviewed. So all of that took a long time. That's another shot of just showing the. Not only that, we found that there were buildings outside of that. Also, there was something very interesting, which we found very early on right here. This is the hearth. This is the base of a hearth, a fireplace that would have extended probably up to a building that was on top of this. But we didn't really have enough done to understand it at the time. Now we do. This map is the latest map diagram that essentially shows all the buildings that we have found. There's that hearth right here. There's another building right there, and it goes under that wall of that building right there. This is the hotel. So this shows that there was an occupant here early on, and that explained why this building has a kitchen hearth in it. It's not just a slave's quarters. It had a kitchen hearth because this was the kitchen for that building. So also this is the well for that building. There was probably another building built early right there, which is gone pretty much by the end of the hotel period. And then the Chamberlain family occupies this building and lives there and runs a dry goods store. But the hotel probably built these extra 2 slave rooms down here. So artifacts. The great thing about St. Stephen's, one of the reasons that the expedition likes it so much, and the reason one makes it so much fun for people who have never done archaeology before, is we actually find stuff, a lot of stuff. That's not really what we're after, but it is great just because it helps us understand what it was like to live there and the things that they had and didn't have. We dig in a certain 1 meter unit, about 3 foot square. We dig in levels that are probably no more, they're usually 10 to 15 centimeters deep, each one. And so every artifact is located, its provenience is located specifically on the site so that it can be analyzed as to what it actually means, because that's what makes artifacts. It's not the artifacts, it's what we can induce about their meaning by looking at the whole site and studying it. You notice that this young woman has found a French wine bottle, very cool. This is a bottle too, but it's made out of stoneware, made in England. And it's an ink bottle because, again, we were at a period when quill pens were the norm, and you had to have ink. So you could go down to this particular dry goods store if you wanted to and have buy a small amount of ink or buy a whole bottle. These are some other ceramics and other artifacts in that unit. All right, how about some gold? What's the most asked question I get when we're out on a site? Finding any gold? Well, not really. I mean, the whole site is fabulous, so let's not complain about not finding gold. But people did not lose gold. I mean, if you had gold, that was a big deal. So and if they buried it, we haven't found it. We've dug up the whole site. But they did lose coins. And so we have probably 25 silver coins and copper coins. About half of them are from the United States, and about half of them are Spanish. Well, you say, why are Spanish coins? Well, coinage was very short scarce among the population until about the 1830s. So imagine you have no coinage, no small denomination things. How do you go to a store and buy something, that doesn't cost but 2.5 cents? It's very difficult. So the American government, because of the shortage, made Spanish coinage legal as U.S. tender until about 1835, and it was passed between the people who knew exactly what it was, is just as good as anything that they might have. Oops. So we have. Let's see if I can get back. We have some Spanish coins, and these are American large pennies, and some Spanish and some American coinage. So it's really interesting to see those. But the artifact that's the most numerous in the assemblage in any archaeological assemblage of a historic period is probably going to be glass. We have more glass than anything, and probably second will be ceramics. So you see these guys here, these are some of the volunteers at South, and we're working on trying to isolate the different vessels and, when possible, to reassemble them. So this is a very tedious and difficult but fun process that we go through with the glass and with the ceramics. These are great, interesting collection of bottles, pepper sauce down here, snuff, wine, ink here. This clear bottle actually is a bleeding bottle. If you were sick, they thought they could just take some blood out of you and you would get better. So they would bleed you, and they had to know how much blood they were taking out. So this is a clear bottle. It originally had a big flange on the top right here. We actually have found a fleam, which was a device that they used to do that. Lots of miscellaneous artifacts, quite a bit of writing instruments. This is actually a silver writing pen with a metal quib in it, and that's pretty unusual. Most of them were made, according to Mary Welch, out of geese feathers. This is a eagle cockade that would have been worn during the War of 1812. Of course, many of the people that are there, in fact, Reuben Chamberlain himself was involved in the War of 1812. A spigot, which you can see up here, I think, a dice, clock, pendulum, a mouth harp, a soap, bubble blowing whistle. Just all kinds of fantastic artifacts that we found on that site. Glass beads, a lot of glass beads, very well liked by, traded with Indians, liked a lot by the African American community there, as well as probably many others. Smoking pipes, not a lot of smoking pipes, but they are there. They're mostly face pipes, which are really fun. Buttons, we have really thousands of different buttons. And they're made out of a lot of different materials, from shell to bone. There's a bone one, to copper brass, just a lot of different materials. But bone is probably the most predominant material made, and bone is very hard. Animal bone is very hard, and you can really use it's kind of the plastic of the period. So these dies are cut out of bone and shell and other things, or cast with copper brass or that sort of thing. This is a military button from the period, and these are animal bones. Bone preservation is great up there because of the soil. So we know what people were eating, and what do you think they were eating in the country? Chickens and deer, and no, these people love pigs and cows. They're eating mostly pigs and cows, and that means they have money. You have to pay for pigs and cows; they're expensive. Really interesting hardware. Too much to actually go into right now. A hoe. And this is a hinge from one of the doors, a big key. That's a typical hinge. And these hinges, what's interesting, they're made by local blacksmiths, because most everything else comes from England. Parasols, quite popular during the period and not absent at all from St. Stephen's. The ceramics, though, have always been one of my most interesting things to study, and we have an unbelievable assemblage of artifacts. But as most everything else from St. Stephen's they're from England. England dominates the war of consumer goods in the United States during this period. So up until really the end of the 19th century, they're really dominant. And then America begins to get a foothold in some of these things. And guess who dominated the 20th century, or is going to dominate the 21st? The 20th is China. If you look and see how many things are made in China, but we don't really know where the 21st century is going to be right now. But England had the dominated, and they had run their ceramic industry to amazing heights of technology and production. This is one of the men that did it, Wedgwood. He was able to elevate pearlware in 1760s to probably the most sought after ware there was. But as you see, it's very plain, but it's beautifully done. It's very beautiful, and often it was hand painted, but we don't find any of that. But we found a lot of creamware out there. It's a lot of platters and plates, but it also contains utilitarian wares like a chamber pot, and a salt and a pepper shaker. The most common thing and the cheapest thing you could buy was called edgeware. These are just mostly plain whiteware types of vessels, mostly plates and other serving containers, and they just have an edge of color around them. They were the cheaper vessels of the day. This was also very popular, and these are usually only used in tea wares. These are hand painted. Every one of them is hand painted. They mostly consist of cups and saucers. The saucers are often in archaeological assemblages called shallow bowls, because the saucers there don't look like the saucers we have today. They were rather large and fairly deep, because tea was consumed in many different ways, mainly drinking. And then in the 1830s, we have different colors that are brought in, technology, the chrome colors, like these reds and blues and things that are quite bright. Also, this was at the end of the decorating period when they began to just use blue because it was cheaper to make that way. They didn't have to. The decorators which did all these didn't have to use different colors. This is another very popular, you probably, if you've done any antiquing, you've heard this called mocha, which is really a bad term. Mocha is actually that. But there are a lot of decorative styles in this. And if you're a collector, you would realize that these are one of the most expensive things on the market, but they died out by the Civil War, but we have a lot of examples of that. This was the big breakthrough. This was in the 17th century and 16th and all around that period. China had an amazing ability to produce porcelain, blue porcelain, and it became so rare that the only people that could actually sort of legally own it were kings and queens. Eventually, the wealthy could do it. But guess, who wanted it was all the other people. And so it became very popular, but they couldn't make it. England didn't have the technology to make porcelain like this. But if you look at this piece right here, you see these decorative things, the border, you see the temple over here, the birds up here, the little bridge over here. These are the elements you see, and probably the most popular one ever produced. This is blue willow, and it was produced by Spode sometime around 1790, and it's still produced today. And we have many examples of that particular type of vessel. These are also done in that early style, which uses a lot of traditional Chinese imagery rather than more anglicized patterns. Soon they began to branch out, though, into other patterns that were copies basically of paintings and drawings and things like that. This one is a copy of that. If you look, you see the building, you see this, you see the house in the background. Right there, the sheep. But they've changed a lot of things. They made it more spectacular. And this one would have more properly been named Bridge and Cross and Cottage, but it's named Wild Rose because of these roses that are shown on the water. But soon there was a patent act passed by the British government which wouldn't allow them to do that anymore. They couldn't copy things without paying for it, and so they just started making up their own. And these are some of the things they made up. This is probably one of the most popular styles, which is very pastoral, lots of rural scenes and workers and people and cottages, and very quaint. This style, there were several styles that have been identified to help kind of classify these things. Unfortunately, is that me? Huh? Okay. Well, we have quite a few of these plates, this is the Town Hall in Albany, New York. Pretty ugly building, and why we ended up with those, I can't tell you. These are a lot more fun. This is a historical pattern which shows the hero of Lake Champlain, and my British friend really didn't like to fight him too much. He thought it was kind of rude. And of course, one of the most important things that happened, or most celebrated, was the Lafayette's trip through the South in the 1824 to 26, and he passed right by St. Stephen's and didn't stop. We hurt our feelings, but we were just a little community at that time. State Seal of New York, anybody? This is a style that became popular later in the period, much whiter, more detailed decoration, but not particularly beautiful. This is called Indian temples, which shows you how little these people understood about Indian temples. That looks to me like a castle in Europe to me. It doesn't look like Indian temples. This is probably my favorite plate. This is called Fishermen Tending Their Net. You have a Chinese boat, Chinese men here in front, a very Chinese style tree. And then all over the side right there, you have a Greek temple. That's pretty weird. And then all these nice people. You have weeping willows and palm trees, and a little quaint village over here, very European looking, and mountains. So just whatever they could come up with and sell, they did it and didn't worry too much about whether it was accurate or not. Today we have identified about 800 vessels, individual vessels, and 346 at this point are blue transfer like this. Then there's my great English friend who I mentioned, who talks about, he's always coming up with great news and sayings and things like that. And he said, one day we were kind of mulling over we found something, we couldn't figure out what it was. We were mulling over it. And he says, well, it's a thing of purpose. I went, wow, why didn't I think of that? I mean, that's fabulous, because you just don't know. But you can always look at something and say, somebody made this, so it's a thing of purpose. We know those are scissors, but what is that? Anybody got any idea? Well, I tell you that sugar was produced in loaves. This is a sugar nipper for cutting off pieces of lumps off of a piece of sugar, a loaf of sugar. And this actually is a blade which was not used for cheese. As Jim thought, it's actually for cutting fodder because you have horses, so you have fodder. That's my favorite artifact because it has the initials of Hannah Lindsay Chamberlain. She was the woman that lived in the house. She had 8 children. She died at 39, and only 3 of them had died by the time she died, and only 3 actually survived to adulthood, and 2 of those died fairly early. Only 1 made it to old age, and she never married. So this is the bicentennial, so we're really trying to play this up. In about 2 or 3 weeks, we will reach that 200-year date when the legislature first met. And we have a dig that has just started on the Douglas Hotel. We've been out there 3 Saturdays, and you are definitely welcome to come dig with us, as I mentioned, or to attend the expedition program coming up in this summer in June, and it is open to junior high school adults on 3 different week camping sessions. And if you have ever know anything about it, it is a fabulous thing to do, a lot of fun. And so it's something to definitely look into. You can get that on the Alabama Museum of Natural History website. So thank you very much for coming. I have some handouts over here and some artifacts up here, and I have an email list right there. If you would like to receive our emails, please sign that list. But thank you very much for having me, and I'll take any questions that we have time for.
All right, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. And I see my loyal ones raising their hands. Thank you so much. We're just recording today's session for YouTube, so make sure we can hear everybody. So started.
Were all the pictures of the ceramic and porcelain, were those all found at this site, or were some of them just examples?
No, some of them weren't. I mean, like that example of Chinese porcelain, right. No. Okay. But 98% of what you saw was found at the site. As I said, we have already isolated about 950 vessels. We don't just count pieces. We try to get them understand the vessels. So some we have 4 or 5 of them, some only 1 or 2, but all in all, there's a big number. It's great. It's a lot of fun to work on. Big puzzles with no help.
Did settlements of that time have banks? And if so,
yes.
How do you protect this area when there's nobody digging?
I couldn't get the last part of that.
How do you protect the area when nobody's digging there?
Well, it is a park right now, and it is now policed, shall we say, by the St. Stephen's Historical Commission. So we get pretty good security. We had to send a couple of guys in. We had to arrest a couple of guys for stealing bricks one time, and that I think got around the community. So we don't have any of those problems, thank goodness. But we do try to. People are in the town, old town, all the time, and we try to protect it. And you wouldn't know where to dig anyway.
This row is very curious. We have another question right here.
Okay.
Since you found some of the structures by digging, is there any future plans to actually put some of the buildings back up to actually show what they look like back in the day?
I didn't get the last part.
The structures. Building the structures.
Well, the way you can actually, when you get on a site, we tend to test it with small shovel tests. And that kind of gives us an idea of where things are. And then we start by actually pretty much putting down a 2x2 unit, a test unit. And when you actually find something like a wall, you follow it. So, that's how we do it. We don't use metal detectors. We sometimes probe. Sometimes you can find walls by probing with a probe that doesn't hurt anything. But generally we have excavated that site you saw on the drawing. We have excavated the whole site over the last 20 years. So.
And do you have future plans to build on that area? I think was the question he had.
No, but if you noticed in the pictures of the Globe Hotel, there is a mock-up of the front of the building. And we did that because people just can't, in their heads, get what that town looked like because it's just woods now. So we know that the size of that building, and we know it was 2 stories. And so we put up a mock of the front of it just to give you an idea what the size of the buildings were in the town. And we have an archaeological trail now that has about, right now, 30 different nice interpretive plaques to explain what you're seeing.
I'm assuming, and maybe incorrectly so, that the good stuff was carried off by the inhabitants. The china, the pieces were they found in kind of a discard pile, or were they in?
Well, most of it, yes, but a lot of it was broken when it was being used, and all the bottles actually had value. They showed up in your probate inventory if you had some when you died, but broken ceramics, no, that was just thrown away in the trash pits and everything else. And so yeah, they took they took most whatever they could, but you live on a site like that for that many years, you lose stuff, and that's why we have 20 nice little silver coins. But yeah, they moved mostly to Mobile. When the town dwindled, Mobile got a lot of those that population, and by 1823 or so, Mobile was about 3,000 people, and St. Stephen's was 300 people. So a lot of the merchants went down there, and the people did, because it was the biggest town in the region, really. Or you could have headed out west to Texas and regretted it, but but that's what happened. People kind of just moved away, or they went to Mobile. Or they might have gone to Natchez, but. We were actually now studying Mobile records to try to find, we know some of the residents. If you're familiar with Barton Academy and Government Street Church, that was built by one of the St. Stephen's residents that moved down there. He financed both of those buildings. So we have connections to Mobile. We just haven't had time to research them yet.
All right, we have a question in the back.
How did St. Stephen's get its name?
Governor Miro. His name was Miro Esteban, which was Stephen, but Stephen is actually a name referring to St. Stephen's, and so it was probably the fort was named after him, probably, but it became known as St. Stephen's after his patron saint, I suppose, maybe, and it was just anglicized to St. Stephen's after America took over.
One of your early images showed a quarry.
The quarry was it's on a limestone outcrop, very unusual geologically in Alabama. It's an outcrop of limestone that comes up there, and the quarry was operated from about 1900 because cement, concrete became important building material, and there was the right kind of limestone there to get it. So they started mining it then, and they mined it till about 1997. The good thing is they left us a nice big lake, and that we have, fortunately, about 600 acres of land. The historic site covers about 50 acres. So that extra acreage actually allows us a way to make a little money to keep ourselves afloat. So it's been a blessing, rather than some historic sites that just don't have anything like that. You can't make it by just charging people to get in to see your nice house or whatever.
But was anything lost in the quarry, archaeologically speaking?
Yes. Fortunately, the quarry, people that operated machinery there said that they did hit bottles and things. They did find sites, particularly in that place I call Franklin, which is right in the middle of the quarry. But most of it, the center of it in St. Stephen's and in Rodney has not been disturbed. And it was kind of on the outskirts of St. Stephen's where the quarry is. Plus, there was a federal quarter there, the federal section. People didn't know where it was exactly, and it was owned by the federal government, so they were afraid to build on it. So they just never built anything out there. And it's kind of still there. But we lost stuff, but what we have remaining, people say, when do you think you'll finish this project? I will never finish this project. And from 200 years or 300 years from now, archaeologists will still be looking at St. Stephen's because it's got 200, 300, 400 sites to look at. And we know a lot about it historically. So that's really great to have some information to start from, some historical data and then archaeological data, and put the two together.
All right, we have a question right here, and then we'll work our way back to the front, I promise.
Hi, my husband, his last name is Miro, and so I'm very interested in Esteban. And what do we know about him? And is there anything from that Spanish that you have found?
We've never. The fort was destroyed by the Quarry in 1961, so we don't have that anymore. But we do have a file on Esteban Miro, but only just stuff that's mentioned in the various St. Stephen's records. All we know, we have a picture of him that you saw up there, so we have his portrait, but I don't know that. But there should be information available about him, and he was evidently. He was instrumental in kind of paying attention to that region early on. So that's why we get the fort, and that's where we get the name.
All right, Mary Beth has a question here, and then we'll come up here and then back here.
You referenced that a lot of those names were no longer found in the records, and you would talk about that later. Is that just because they moved away, or did they have a big plague or anything that took a lot of people out? Did you find a cemetery?
We have a cemetery. We only have 4 remaining markers. Although it's obvious that several hundred people are buried there. But no, I think that what happened, and if you saw the judge I showed you earlier, he said that the people that lived there were litigious, they were distrustful, they were mostly refugees from the Revolutionary War, and felons. He didn't have a good opinion of it at all. So that's one possibility, is some of those people were on the run, and so they don't show up in later records because they didn't stay, or they stayed up there and kind of kept their heads down and don't get recorded much. But we really can't focus out on the counties because we just have more to do that's right in St. Stephen's. So we only focus on St. Stephen's, and there's a list, which I don't have out, I don't think. We have at least 500 names already on that list, and probably when we update it, there'll be 700 or 800 that we know live there. So if you think you might have had a family member there, if you will email me with that name, we have a folder on all those people. So we'll tell you what we got. It may be one piece of paper, but sometimes they get pretty thick with information. So yeah, we're trying to collect all that, get to know those people.
To put things into perspective, how large an area have we been talking about?
Have we what?
How large an area?
Of the town, we haven't excavated just one lot, and we're starting on one building. So the town it had probably 300 or 400 lots, and they say that it had 450 buildings. So it's much bigger than what we even have exposed right now. Most of it is still covered in woods. We probably don't have more than 10 or 15% cleaned up, and we have the main part, but there's a lot of the town is bigger, much bigger than that. Probably occupies at least 30 or 40 acres. Just St. Stephen's, not the other 2 towns, which are there too. And I'm pretty much undisturbed. Also, I will have some giveaways up here. I have artifacts up here, and I'll be glad to answer any questions about them, or if you come up.
All right, we have time for just a couple more questions.
Okay. I can stay here all day. Some people, I'm retired.
How do you go about clearing the land, the trees and so forth? How do you clear it to save as much as you can?
Right. That is a problem. You cannot just go in there with a bulldozer and start taking trees down. You're going to disturb the archaeological deposits. So everything has to be done by hand. So if a tree dies or if a tree becomes dangerous, we just cut, when we did this last renovation for the plaques and the Archaeological Trail, we cut down about 40 trees. because they were dangerous or dead or whatever. But we didn't just take out them willy-nilly. The only reason we have the site is because an agreement was reached with the landowner that we have a long-term lease on it, and they own the timber. So we don't take down timber unless they were to agree to it, because what's the worst thing you can do if you live in the South in Alabama? Sell your family's land. No, that's a sin. And so we have it long-term lease, though. We worked out a nice agreement with them, and so we're happy with that 100-year lease.
So what about the stumps and so forth? How do you clear that? That would be, to me, the issue of getting the stumps out without just ripping up whatever is underneath.
The trees are actually, you're talking about the trees or the artifacts?
The stumps of the trees. The stumps.
Oh, they just sit there. They will eventually rot, because I've been there long enough to see that happen. We don't dig the stumps. We cut them off at the ground. We just leave them there, and in 10 or 20 years, they'll be gone. We work around them. Eventually, they'll be gone. But no, we do not try to do anything with them, because it would disturb the archaeological record.
All right, we have time for one last question. If you have any other questions, I'm sure he'll be happy to stay around. Dr. Shorter will hang out.
All right. When the state government moved to Cahaba, didn't St. Stephen's stay as the county seat for Washington County?
The St. Stephen's, actually, what you have Old St. Stephen's, you have New St. Stephen's. Old St. Stephen's is out toward the river. New St. Stephen's is about 3 or 4 miles away on the highway. There's a courthouse there now, which was built in 1854, that housed all the county records. So St. Stephen's became the capital of the county seat, but it moved in 1900 to Chatham. But it's not Old St. Stephen's. It's
So
New St. Stephen's.
To Chatham. Was that because of the yellow fever?
They did, yeah. Mary Welch actually mentions the health of the area as possibly being why it declined, and they did have a yellow fever epidemic in 1819. However, they had that same people. When you see these on different sites, people tend to think, oh, well, that's what caused this town to go down and what caused this town. And they had the same epidemic in Mobile that killed over half of the people. So when that happens, it happens all up and down the river, not just in one place. So, yeah, they did have a yellow fever epidemic.
Some of these people actually stayed in Washington County. You said they moved to Mobile.
Well, a lot of them did because the economy of the town just went down. I mean, people quit coming. The money quit flowing there. You know what? Washington County is one of the poorest counties in the state now, and it is because there's not a lot of economy. Timber is not big money for many people. So it was the timber industry, and there was nothing left for, until the quarry came. The quarry was a big lifeblood of the county for about 75 years. It provided a lot of jobs.
There's nothing actually of any significance in Millry right now, because it is a railroad town developed in the early 1900s. So do y'all have any idea where they moved that courthouse to in that area?
The courthouse is there now.
And that they moved to in Chatham?
No. Oh, not the courthouse. The courthouse is still owned by the Historical Commission of St. Stephen's. So we own the courthouse, but it's not in the same location. It's in its same location, but not in Old St. Stephen's. It's in New St. Stephen's. But we own it, and it's just been renovated, and you can certainly visit. It's a great building built. It was on the Habs drawings, and it's a great old 2-story building built in 1854.
Wasn't that on your first slide? I think it's on the first slide you put up. I think it had that picture.
Had what?
Was it the first slide?
I think it was on the first slide.
It might have been. Yeah, it's a great old building. You can look it up real easily on the internet. It's a great building, and there's several others that you would almost mistaken to be the same exact building. Their designs are very common.
All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed, and Mr. Shorter will be around.
Thank you.